Well, thank you very much. Thank you for attending. I'd like also to thank the organizers to give me the opportunity to moderate this session. Definitely the talks were enlightening. Thanks to the speakers here. And we're going to continue on the discussion for another 30 minutes. I'd like to give a note to the audience that the organizers are expecting you to post your questions to the websites posted here. We're not going to accept anything directly from the floor, only through this application. The first question that I have here is that actually came through. This application is for Professor Dirk, and this was posted by Mr. Ahmed. Do you think that collaborative software development between giant IT companies could stop IP war if FOSS IP model is adapted or adopted?
Thank you for the question. I think it already has. So if you look at companies like IBM, SAP, and Oracle, who collaborate to develop the software for the infrastructure of the internet as part of the Apache Software Foundation, you can see how they can collaborate. They've learned to collaborate. And as part of this, and also the Linux Foundation, they have set up mechanisms to deal with, for example, patent issues by way of patent innovation networks and agreements not to sue each other. So the desire to collaborate actually lets them put aside many of the potential feuds they might have with each other. Not always, not under all circumstances. These are still for-profit companies, but actually when it comes to open source, they want to and they're honestly interested in collaboration, they will put those struggles aside usually.
Thank you, Professor. I actually saw that your title was Professor of Open Source, and I was probably wondering, how could you become a Professor of Open Source? How could someone become a Professor of Open Source?
Okay,
this is for us in academia, and maybe for the students as well.
That's a particular idiosyncrasy of the German system. I'm simply a professor at a German university, professor of computer science. Somehow professors in Germany get a more specific title. And I do software engineering, but we already have a professor of software engineering. So okay. I more or less got to choose the next best thing, or maybe the even better thing, and we just invented it. And the good thing is, yes, it's unique. Great marketing.
It's a very good upgrade as well, I think. Thank you. The next question is for Frank, and this came from Khalil. Do you think that the next fight for FOSS advocates is no more software but data? And do you think also that GDPR is a solution to this?
That's a big question. GDPR is a step in a direction which I, in general, think is a good one. I wouldn't say that GDPR is perfect or great, but I think it's a step in a direction where society or countries or governments realize that they have a responsibility also for data and for security and privacy and data protection. So I think this is definitely a step in the right direction. Of course, the question is really, really big, because if you, I don't know if that was implied with the question, but data is something that is really important, as I talked in my talk, because software alone is no longer enough. If you look at what's going on in machine learning and artificial intelligence, neural networks, then having access to the software alone gives you nothing. You need the data to train the network. So data is something that you also need. If you have all the software in the world but not the data, you'd have nothing.
Thank you. I think that's clear. Here's basically, it could be an annoying question probably for developers and for those who want to adopt open source software. I could probably direct this to Gilles. This came from Saeed Al-Badi, who's asking how to answer someone that says that open source apps are not secure. We always get this question.
That says that open source what?
That open source applications or software is not secure. How would you answer such a question?
I would say that, that first of all, statistics show that it is more. There was a report created by a company called Coverity a few years back, and they looked at software quality, compared open source versus proprietary. What they did was they counted the number of defects per 1,000 lines of code. And one thing they found was that the number of defects per 1,000 lines of code is about the same for proprietary and open source. And the detail is that the number they find is in favor of open source, actually. The report shows that you have 0.6 defects per 1,000 lines of code for open source and 0.7 something for proprietary. So it's the same, roughly the same value, and it's in favor of open source. What I want to say, though, which is the real difference, is that with open source, everybody has a chance to look at the source code. The bad guys and the good guys. When you look at proprietary software, the only people who have access to the source code is the company who makes it and the bad guys. Because the bad guys will always have access to the source code. They will pay somebody, they will steal a copy somewhere. And those who have access to the source code can find bugs. And if they're the bad guys, they will exploit the bugs. If they're the good guys, they will propose fixes to the bugs. I'll take 2 minutes to tell the story.
Sure, definitely.
When I was at Sun Microsystems, we open sourced our operating system, Solaris. And we made the open source version available on a Monday. The next day, Tuesday, somebody came to us, sent us a report of a serious, really, really bad bug that would let anybody become administrator on the machine by just typing the right logging string at a login prompt. Really bad bug. And when they sent that to us, they also sent us a patch. The guy had looked at the source code and found a really bad bug, wrote a patch and sent it to us saying, this is the problem. We looked at the patch, we implemented it, we published a temporary patch for customers under support on Thursday. It went well. And on the Saturday, we published the final patch for everybody. That was the fastest time ever in the industry that a security bug was found and patched by a vendor. We couldn't have done it without open source because the person who reported the patch had the source code and gave us reported the bug, had the source code and reported the patch as well. So it really is in favor of open source. When you have open source, somebody finds a bug. If they're a good guy, you will get the patch with it. If they're a bad guy, you will probably get an attack with it.
Thank you for the answer. That could also probably relate to what Professor Dirk was talking about. Now the innovation is user-led, and the user could probably contribute much better in terms of securing these open source softwares. And while you are at it, because I can see many questions coming around this application here about security, and you've talked about blockchain, I think, and you have an experience with blockchain. Could you tell us what would be the situation for blockchain now with quantum computing on the rise and it's on the horizon? Because there are some people or some organizations who have started implemented, took the first steps, and then now they're rethinking they could be rethinking their decisions on that.
Blockchain and quantum computing. The interesting thing about quantum computing is, and we should have my friend from IBM here because he would be able to give also a part of the answer, but the issue with quantum computing is that there are algorithms that will break traditional cryptography really well once quantum computers are there. And I used to work for a company that does quantum physics-based cryptography, so we did that just to fix that problem. So that's one area where I'm really aware of. And what happens is that the encryption algorithms that can be broken by quantum computers are really the ones that are used in blockchains like Bitcoin, who use proof of work, intense computation. So if you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin has been designed from the start to be able to evolve. The encryption strength changes, the parameters vary, so that regardless of the computing power we can throw at it, finding a new block always takes 10 minutes, for example. So I wouldn't worry too much about these kind of blockchains when quantum computers appear, because the algorithms will evolve. they will switch to quantum resistant and things like that. But more importantly, there are a whole bunch of blockchains who don't use these same algorithms and who use other cryptographic primitives and who don't use proof of work for securing the system. So honestly, I am not really sure that that quantum computing is a forever problem for blockchain. It's a temporary threat that will be addressed normally really simply.
Thanks. I think that sounds like a relief for those who are concerned with security, that now the antidote is there, and it's always going to be there, probably. The next question is from Ward Al-Habsi, and I think it's directed to Frank. It reads, can we use Nextcloud as a file sender to transfer large files for research purposes? Is there any examples of this use?
That's possible, and Nextcloud is used by a lot of universities for exactly that, actually. So there is like organizations like DAISY, which are like the German version of CERN, particle accelerator. They use Nextcloud to transfer like petabytes of data around to their research universities for exactly that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Again, this is probably a related question and was posted by Sulaiman. Can we run operating systems in cloud for users in anywhere without setting it up, without having to set it up? Is that doable?
Yeah, I discussed this once with the old times with an investor, where I said, look, the benefit of Nextcloud is that it's so flexible, and the drawback of Nextcloud is that it's so flexible. So you can do a lot with Nextcloud. You can, with one click, spin up an Amazon AWS instance with Nextcloud installed, and you can run it for a lot of users there. There are lots of big service providers where you can run Nextcloud on top of. So you can basically deploy it wherever you want. I think there are even like scripts to deploy it on Google Cloud or on the Microsoft Azure Cloud very easily. So it's super easy. Of course, I have to say that if you do this, part of the value proposition of Nextcloud goes away. Right? If you trust, like, I don't know, the Microsoft Cloud, then why not use Office 365 in the first place? The Nextcloud has some encryption features. If you use end-to-end encryption, then you have some protection there, of course. But at the end of the day, Nextcloud is all about decentralization. If you deploy Nextcloud in the big American clouds, then it's possible, it's easy, but you'd lose some of the value.
Thank you. Professor Dirk, this is a short question. I'll probably try to make it more clear, hopefully. I think you've mentioned in your slides that organizations that are working in the same field could or should collaborate on developing their needs in software. So that sounds like communities of interests, basically, collaborating and creating kind of a pool of, let's say, shared resources. But this question asks, how could FOSS also be important for governments or for governmental organizations?
I don't think there's a big difference between companies or, say, local governments. Any set of separate entities with some shared interest in software that really is just a cost driver can usually join forces. The challenge is often, though, with local governments, sometimes political. Do you want to work with these other guys or not? Or between companies, it's competition that may get in the way. So the challenge, some sort of product management challenge, if you will, is to find out exactly what is considered not competitively differentiating between these different entities. What can you agree on that is really common to all of you, doesn't make a difference as you face your own constituents, and so you are not inclined to get difficult with the other people to get your particular requirements. So there needs to be a process, which is one of the reasons why we need this sort of foundation as an arbiter, as a body where you have defined rules for settling these disputes or these challenges. You need to have a process where you can agree on what do you share, what's your shared interest here, so that you can get that turned into software. and the things that you cannot agree on are left to your own individual initiative. So that applies to local governments as well as companies, I think. If you're thinking the whole government of a country, it gets tricky, yeah? But maybe you have neighboring countries that have similar requirements, and there's some layers in this ever more complex world of software where you can actually collaborate irrespective of whatever other disputes you might have.
Thank you. Do you see this becoming like an agenda item for discussion at the advocates of ICT use at the UN, for example, or any of the global non-profit organizations? Could this become one of the agenda items for discussion?
So I can only speculate here. I have not talked with the United Nations or any of these bodies. The closest I got was to the chief agriculturalists when the agriculture people who have similar problems with software came by and asked what can we do about it. I can easily imagine that this will be of a high relevance as industries which are not the software industry realize that they need to do something about it. So I believe, yes, that's absolutely possible. I would be delighted to help that, but it hasn't happened yet.
All right, thanks. I'd like to encourage the audience to post their questions to the application. These are not the kind of people who you'll see walking around the corridors every day, so we are very fortunate to have them for such a short time. Please take advantage of the opportunity. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something regarding the governments and open source. The two elements. First of all, from the United Nations, I've had discussions with them, and they're actually putting in place training programs for refugees that are based on open source. The idea is that refugees, when they arrive in a country, if they have no skills, they represent no interest for the country, and it's very hard to justify accepting them, as we've seen in many places. If they come and they gain skills and they can work, it helps, and open source is a great way to train them on some of the work markets. From a government's interest in open source, what I've heard, and that came from the French government, which is a strong user of open source. They're using open source for two ethical reasons. Well, one ethical and one financial reason. The ethical one is they're saying everything that's developed by a government should belong to the citizens, because in a republic means the thing of the public. So the government is basically belonging to the citizens. So everything they develop should belong to the citizens. It should be open source and shared with the citizens. From a financial perspective, it's really, they have a strange and interesting analysis. They're saying if we pay citizens to develop software, the money we pay to the citizens is not licenses that go to the US, but it's money that goes to the citizens. These citizens use this money to buy food, to pay for their houses, to pay for taxes. And so this money gets re-injected into the society. Nice. And these citizens, as they learn to develop the software, they gain knowledge. So, and knowledge is wealth, because they can create companies from that as well. So the government in itself, even though they may be paying for the software the same way they would pay for proprietary software, they're seeing this money injected into something that has a return which is positive. So from an overall state budget, open source is a money or wealth generator instead of being a cost element. And that's an interesting perspective. Again, I heard that from the French government, not necessarily applies to everywhere else.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. Again, there are many other questions. I think let's call them. They're related basically to security, or the other side of the coin, which is privacy. Is privacy there when it comes to open source, and how is it protected? I don't know if you want to answer that.
Sure.
Nextcloud.
Yeah, I find this very an interesting question, because I think we heard earlier from your first talk about how the free software movement and the open source movement started. And I think, I don't remember exactly your quote, what you said, but you said something like, look, if you have, the software is free software, then you have control over your thing, your data and your digital stuff. Right? This, of course, came from the world where you had your computer under your desk, and this was your computer. You paid for the hardware, and you installed free software on it, and then you're basically 100% in control. But of course, nowadays, the world is more complex because you have distributed systems, we have clouds and, I don't know, phones and everything syncing around and networks and entities in between. And in this world, it's a lot harder to reach this privacy and control thing. And I think the solution here is to have more distributed systems. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody should run their own cloud server in their basement. Some people might. I mean, some people are crazy like me. I have my own mail server. I wouldn't recommend this to anybody, but I do this. But some people do. But even if you get your cloud service from your company or your university or your local service provider, it's already better than basically have one company who does it for the whole planet. So this is not good for privacy and security.
I have two questions for you. I think I'll bundle them up, and then I'll move to a question for Professor Dirk. How do you see Nextcloud after 5 years? And what is the maximum storage capacity for each user, and how can we increase it? And also in terms of related support and resources, we're a bit far from Germany, and how could you offer us support if we decide to implement Nextcloud?
Okay, so let's start with the easy question first. The amount of storage per user. I mean, we are free software. There are no limits, right? There is no point of building any limits into the software, so there is no limit. You can store inside Nextcloud as much data as you have storage until your hard disk or your server is full. But there is nothing in the software, of course. Then about the support, that's a good question. Our business model is, as I have explained, the software is completely open and free software, but we offer enterprise subscriptions similar to what Red Hat and SUSE is doing. And we also, that's the good news, do this through partners. So we have partner companies all over the world. Unfortunately, I'm not really completely sure if you have someone in Oman already. Maybe someone knows someone who could partner with us to do this. But I know that, for example, the Dubai police is a customer from us, and they have a partner. There's at least a partner in Dubai, so we have partners all over the world. So this is the thing. What was the first question?
How do you see Nextcloud in 5 years?
Yeah,
and I'll add to that also. How do you make money? If this is all free.
The hardest question, and I spared this for the end. I mean, I'm very ambitious, so I hope that we, as an open source and free software community, we can really compete with the big guys. So for us, it would mean that we can really compete with Microsoft Office 365 and others to be basically a player in this market where not everybody depends on this one solution. This would be my personal dream and goal for the next 5 years. And I know that everybody in the community has the same goal, and this is why everybody's working super hard in this direction. How far we come there, I don't know, but this would be like the goal for 5 years. And how you make money, I already explained it, I think. You can use the software as you want, download it, do whatever you want with it. But you can also work with us as a company. You get a subscription, and then you get like a special version of Nextcloud, which has a more hardened release cycle, security patches earlier. I think you explained it as Sun earlier, right? Where your customers got security fixes before the rest. We do exactly the same. We have access to documentation, to scalability reviews, and so on. So basically similar as Red Hat. That's how you make money.
Thank you. By the way, those questions came from Tuhaib and Omar. And we have a question from Ahmed Al-Ghadani now for Professor Dirk. What do you think of Microsoft acquiring GitHub and IBM acquiring Red Hat, considering both companies' history? IBM is the biggest contributor to Red Hat, while Microsoft isn't, or did not contribute much to open source community. This is actually a worry for the open source community. It's one day it's open source, and then overnight it becomes something else.
Well, so that's a big question. Before I get there, can I shortly make a note on privacy, because there's a bigger story behind that. Open source is very inspiring, for example, for students, but in general because of the idea of sharing and altruism and working together for a better world. And that is truly important. But it is also important to understand that the things that the open source world invented, these licenses, these collaboration mechanisms, the tools, are in many ways neutral. They can be used for good or bad. They can be used to prevent privacy or help privacy. If anything, the open source world asking for open collaborative processes will lay more things in the open than they will keep private. In the open source definition, it explicitly says no discrimination against fields of endeavor. So if you change an open source license to say my software cannot be used for the evil in the world, it's not open source any longer. So it's very important to move to an understanding there's a tool chest of different things that you can use for purposes, and you use it for your goals. Now, going back to the big industry questions about the recent acquisitions of 2018, Microsoft has come a long way, so that's for sure. Microsoft has joined the Linux Foundation. Microsoft understands Grok's open source, I believe, under its new CEO. So I'm not so worried about GitHub changing its tune and not being a place for open source software development in the future. I have very little worries that Microsoft will go back to old ways and be unfriendly to the open source world. IBM and Red Hat, I don't know. But I trust that IBM will be a good steward. I don't see any reason to assume they will not be valuing their $34 billion investment. But in some sense, in a smart way, when the Linux distributors, as the commercialization of the Linux operating system pitched against Microsoft 15, 20 years ago, came about, the companies purchasing, the users, were smart enough to realize, no, we don't just want one Linux distributor to fight Microsoft and then be in the same problem spot because there's exactly one Linux distributor we depend upon. They deliberately split resources, many did, and utilized different Linux distributors. So for that reason, SUSE, which was sadly for a German company not winning against Red Hat, was propped up and supported, so there are viable Linux distribution alternatives to Red Hat. Should IBM turn bad, which I don't think, there will be viable Linux distribution alternatives, and that are commercially supported, and that's the strength of open source.
Thank you very much. I think we're running out of time, but I have time for probably two more questions. One from Talal Said, and that's again about security, but this time about digital forensics in cloud. So what's the challenge of cloud and security perspectives, and how to make the digital forensics working in cloud, in your opinion, basically? Do you want to take that, or yeah?
Wow. The biggest challenge from cloud and security is that when it comes to cloud, you don't really know where your stuff is running and who's sitting next to the machine and looking at it. That said, most cloud service providers have a much better security story in terms of securing their data centers than you could have as a company. I think it's a balanced issue. Some governments will be running that would be much more secure, and of course the tricky part is making sure the data that transits between where you are and where the cloud is transits in a secure way. Again, whether it's traditional cryptography or quantum-based cryptography, if you're paranoid enough. It really depends on the use case. The technology is there to make it as secure as it needs to be. All right, as forensics always does, depends on the case. So I hope that answered your question, Mr. Talal Said. Last question for Frank, and then we'll have to end this. This comes from Faisal Nu'mani. He is from Oman Gas Company, and
He asks, how can they get benefit from Nextcloud in the oil and gas companies, as they have a lot of data, and also does Nextcloud have the ability to analyze the data?
So Nextcloud, I think I haven't really clearly mentioned this in my talk, is actually software that contains, it's basically built out of a lot of different plugins, different parts. We call them apps. They're server-side plugins, and there are lots and lots of them. So by itself, Nextcloud can't do any analysis of any data. But we have plugins to do that. So there are some plugins to visualize and to analyze medical data, for example. They already exist, built by some hospitals, so you can use them. Or if there are already some other applications that analyze data, you can integrate them. So a project we are doing with Dirk. Dirk is the organization in Denmark, which is the organization which basically does all the IT infrastructure for all universities in Denmark. And they have a supercomputer there, and they're using Nextcloud, and they're integrated in a way that every time a researcher uploads a certain file, an external script is triggered, which sends the data to the supercomputer, analyzes it, and when it's done, sends it back, and it shows up in the Nextcloud on the phone of the researcher, on the tablet, or whatever they want to do. So something like that we can do, but we don't really do any data mining or anything ourselves. But there are lots of other very nice open source software solutions for that can be easily integrated into Nextcloud, but we are not really, that's not really our focus.
Thank you, Frank. I think that's time for us, but I'll probably take the liberty and give each one of you a minute if you want to have any closing remarks before we end this. And also, I'd like to apologize for those who posted their questions. We didn't have the time to answer them. But I promise you, these guys are going to be around during the breaks, and you could probably contact them, ask questions, or they've posted most of their contacts here, so you could probably email them your questions. So, Frank, if you want to add anything. Then.
Just a quick remark. I really like the aspect from Dirk that open source is really about collaboration also, not only the license. And the licenses are important, I completely agree with that, but the way to collaborate between different organizations on the same playing field, I think this is really big. So this is not mentioned often enough, so I completely agree with that. Nextcloud, for example, we have contributors all over the world, really most countries, 1,800 contributors who work together to build like this software together, and this wouldn't be possible in the old world in no way. So we couldn't employ all 1,800 developers. We couldn't coordinate between them, right? How should like the management structure work there, reporting, product management? This would be totally impossible. But this just works with the open source tool. So I think this is a very, very good aspect. So thanks for bringing this.
Thank you. Professor Dirk?
Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Now I just thought I'm at a university, so maybe I can encourage students to go into open source. It's both a positive and a warning story, because so for students, open source is out there. You can just get active. It's usually communities that are happy and willing to work with any reasonable suggested contributions, as long as you're respectful to a project and incrementally approach it and discuss, say, I would like to make a contribution, here's how it looks like, and then you will usually be well received and even guided to become part of a community. I'm emphasizing this because it's actually, and you will not surprise perhaps to hear this from me, economically important. There have been lots of studies which show the significance, economic significance of being a software developer active in open source. So as a student, you can get a head start on that, and it will be beneficial to your professional life. How so? Well, studies show it will improve your salary. Companies actually value not only your abilities and skills, they will also value that you have already demonstrated that you can work in teams, meaning you have social capabilities. And beyond that, if you are actually contributing to an economically important project, meaning a component that is widely used, then some employers specifically value your position in that project. So this has been shown in studies. It goes so far, this is the cautionary side of it, that there are companies out there who analyze your developer behavior on GitHub, make it your portfolio, if you will, so that employers can judge you based on your abilities there. So think of your open source contributions or potential open source contributions as a public portfolio of your abilities and your work. And if you do it right, it will be very beneficial to your career in the software industry.
Thank you, Professor. That's really enlightening.
Okay, as a closing remark, maybe I'd like to point out that when an enterprise is considering open source, whether it is to use it or to contribute to it, always keep in mind that if you find reasons to do it that are beyond just saving money, you are going to benefit from open source a lot more, okay? Use open source because it's a great engine for innovation, open innovation. Use open source as a talent acquisition, talent retention mechanism, hiring open source developers by encouraging them to contribute to open source projects during their work time. Use it as a mechanism for speed to market. Use it as a mechanism for marketing, positioning yourself as a thought leader. All of these benefits that go way beyond just saving money on license costs are extremely important ways of making your open source story a very productive one. And to give you an idea of these kind of benefits, I'll just answer 2 points in the questions there quickly. One question was, why do hackers use open source? Because of trust. By being able to access the source code that they're using, they know it's not going to turn against them. They know there's no Trojan horse inside. So use open source for trust, whether you're a corporate or a hacker. And somebody was asking how much Microsoft hasn't contributed to open source that much in the question on GitHub. And it's actually, they're the biggest contributor to GitHub. Not necessarily in code, they do a lot of documentation work and contributions in other forms than just code. But they are a very strong contributor. And when they joined the Open Invention Network, they donated 60,000 patents that cover things that are part of the Linux sphere. And so by donating these 60,000 patents, they're giving the open source developers the permission to write stuff around these areas of technologies and these processes without the fear from being sued. So that is a significant contribution to the open source world. Microsoft has really changed, as you've pointed out. They're really going it in the right direction. And I don't know why they're doing this, but I suspect it's because they think it's the right way to go.
Thank you all, and I wish you a nice afternoon and evening ahead. We're very happy to have you with us. Thank you.
بعد جلسة النقاش الممتعة والمفيدة ندعوكم لاستراحة قصيرة نعود بعدها في 12:30 لتكملة جلسات المؤتمر.
After this interesting discussion, we will have